welcome you here today, those of you in the room and our virtual audience, to a discussion of teacher tenure, an outmoded job for life or essential right to due process. Before I introduce our distinguished panel today, let me tell you that next month we are having a conversation on where we live and where we learn, how we should address the effects of residential segregation by race and class on America's schools. It will be the same place, same time, the second Wednesday of the month, February 10th, 12 to 2, right here. Today's, for those of you who are following on Twitter, because people like having Twitter conversations, the hashtag for today's event is teacher tenure, one word.
Sorry.
In your packets, we have rather extensive biographies of each of the panelists, because each of them has a rather impressive history working in the field of education. Because I never learned how to be a principal and read long memos to you, I'm just going to give a 1 or 2 sentence introduction to all of them, and those of you who are interested can read more about them in your packet. Leading off today will be Rick Kallenberg, who is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and a member of the board of the Albert Schenker Institute. Rick has written an article which is in your packets that was in a recent edition of the American Educator on the subject of tenure. Going second will be Randi Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers and of the Albert Schenker Institute, and needs no further introduction. Going third will be Jane Hanaway, who's a professor of public policy at Georgetown University and an Institute Fellow at the American Institutes of Research. And she, in particular, has done a lot of work in sociology of education and with the use of data and research on education. And batting cleanup today will be Mark Tucker. Mark is the president and CEO of the National Center on Education and Economy, and for many years has been a leading force in the area of developing standards and national standards for education. Those of you who are watching this on virtual world, on your computer screens at home or in the office, you will be able to send your questions in on Twitter. That's why I have my my iPad here, not because I'm checking my email. And those of you in the room, we will give you little white index cards to ask questions, so you can be thinking about what questions you might want to ask when the panelists are done. Rick?
Thank you very much, Leo. It's my pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel this afternoon on a really important topic. It's been my experience that there's been a lot of misunderstanding around the issue of teacher tenure, which helps explain, I think, why it elicits such anger and outrage from the opponents. So I wrote a biography of Albert Schenker called Tough Liberal a number of years ago, and when I was out on book tour, inevitably the first question from the audience was, why do teacher unions protect incompetent educators? Right? That was the first issue that always came up. And just yesterday I had a a piece in the New York Times about the important role that public sector unions play in our democracy. And again, kind of a torrent of irate emails about, why would I want to be defending organizations that are in the business of protecting incompetent teachers. So I think it's important that we have a nuanced discussion of this issue, and I think that's what we'll likely get today. It seems to me there's a sensible balance we need to strike on this issue of teacher tenure. As I will outline, I think tenure is incredibly important because it frees teachers to do what they need to do for children, for students. The UFT attorney, I think, had got it right when he said that tenure is not a gift to teachers, but something that allows them to do their job. At the same time, I think some tenure protections need some tweaking. In any profession that includes millions of people, inevitably there will be some who don't deserve to remain in the profession, and we have to find sensible ways for them to be removed. And this is something that I think the American Federation of Teachers in particular has been very forthright about. Al Shanker used to write columns in the New York Times where he would acknowledge that there are some lousy teachers in the profession. And his wife Edie would ask, how as the head of a union can you do that? And his response was, well, no teacher reading this thinks I'm talking about them. And Randi, you also have been really forthright on this question and have said in the past, this is a union that is not just about keeping people. We are about keeping qualified people. So that's the balance that needs to be struck on this question. But that's not the type of discussion we're seeing in the media. It's all about caricature and the idea that tenure. Is this? You want me to put it closer?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And the idea that the teacher unions are there to protect the incompetent members. There's a great young journalist who many of you may know, Dana Goldstein, who has suggested that the ineffective tenured teacher has emerged as a feared character, like crack babies or welfare queens from earlier eras. This is from the media treatment. And labor attorney Tom Gagan has said that the bad teacher meme has become so predominant that one can imagine the young Marlon Brando in a remake of On the Waterfront saying, I could have been a contender, but I got that old Miss Grundy in the first grade. Sorry, I won't do any more Marlon Brando imitations. So I want to try to do four things in the next couple of minutes. First, to explain.
But he's really great at his day job.
To explain what tenure is and what it's not. Second, talk briefly about the history of tenure. Why tenure was created for teachers in the first place. Third, talk about the importance of tenure today. And finally, to discuss briefly some ways that it might be reformed. So first, what is tenure? The critics wrongly claim that it is a lifetime guaranteed job. So Terry Moe at the Hoover Institution has said tenure means teachers, quote, who don't murder someone or molest a child or stop showing up to work are assured of being able to continue their job as long as they want. America's private sector workers can only dream of such a thing, a guaranteed, totally secure job. Well, that's false. Tenure provides teachers who have demonstrated competence after a probationary period with due process rights before being fired. So those due process rights include the right to know why a discharge is being sought by the employer and the right to have the issue decided by an impartial body. That's what tenure is. It does not prevent someone from being fired, but it does require that the employer show just cause before termination. Okay, second issue. Why was tenure developed in the first place? So in the United States, tenure was developed in 1909 in New Jersey, and it came out of the clean government movement in order to improve education for children. And there were four big reasons for why tenure came about. First, it was designed to avoid patronage hiring. So previously, you'd have a newly elected mayor come in and fire all the qualified teachers who were in place and put in his cronies, seeing the school system essentially as a jobs program. Secondly, tenure was provided to protect teachers from improper political influence over their activities outside of the classroom. So for example, in Chicago, you had a board president who would fire people for being involved in a union. During World War I, there were Quaker teachers who were fired because they weren't sufficiently supportive of the war effort. During the Civil Rights era, teachers were fired because they became members of the NAACP. So that was a second reason. A third reason tenure was provided was to protect the academic freedom of teachers in the classroom, to provide them the ability to teach evolution, for example. And fourthly, tenure was provided to protect teachers from race and sex discrimination. So during the Depression, you would have women, when they became married, fired because jobs were scarce and the school board thought they didn't need the job. After Brown versus Board of Education, you had a number of southern states eliminate tenure because they wanted the flexibility to be able to fire black teachers in newly integrated schools. Okay, the third major question, are tenure laws necessary today? Now, some critics will say, now with the passage of civil rights laws, civil service protections, and labor laws, that the tenure is no longer necessary. But I think there are three central reasons why it still remains vital today. The first is that tenure strengthens the civil rights protections that we have in place and the labor law protections, because it shifts the burden of proof in the legal setting. So if you bring a civil rights lawsuit for racial discrimination, the burden is on the employee to prove that discrimination occurred, which is not always an easy thing to do, even when there's discrimination taking place. By contrast, with tenure, the burden is on the employer to provide a rationale for firing. So the burden is flipped. Secondly, tenure protects a number of abuses not covered by civil rights laws. So many people don't understand that in the United States we have employment at will, which means that you can be fired for virtually any reason other than certain protected categories. So for example, you can be fired because you are more experienced and therefore more expensive for the employer. Without tenure and without unions, that's perfectly legal for an employer to do. There's evidence that it's especially important for teachers to have these due process protections because they need shielding from two sets of folks in the school system. One is the parents, and the other is the groups of administrators who may have bad educational ideas. So in terms of parents, tenure protects teachers from, a fundamentalist parent who doesn't want HIV prevention taught to children. It protects an English teacher who wants to assign a controversial novel that might be unpopular with certain parents. It protects a teacher against a well-connected parent who's upset that his child got a bad grade, or the parent of an particularly untalented daughter who doesn't get the lead in the play, right? Without tenure, a teacher might not risk making the proper decision. And without tenure, teachers might not stand up to parents who say they want special education students excluded from a classroom, even though the research may suggest that that's good for all kids. The other group of folks that we need to worry about are misguided principals. So, for example, in Holyoke, Massachusetts, there was an administrator who came up with the idea of posting the test scores of every student publicly in order to shame those who hadn't done well. Well, there was an untenured teacher who objected and thought this wasn't the right thing to do pedagogically, and was fired for that reason. So tenure is important to give teachers the ability to stand up to bad educational ideas when they surface. And the third reason tenure is still necessary today is that it's an important recruiting device. There's research, and ironically I'll cite Terry Moe, the big critic of tenure, who found when he polled teachers that having tenure was worth to them tens of thousands of dollars in compensation. So basic economics tells you that if you took away tenure, and wanted to attract the same quality of candidates among teachers, you would have to provide much higher salaries, which is unlikely to happen anytime soon. Okay, fourth and final issue I want to address is how should tenure laws be reformed? So on the one hand, I think tenure is fundamentally a sound and critical concept, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And I think there are two possible areas where we might see reform. First is in the process of granting tenure. In places like California, essentially, tenure decisions are made after 18 months. And it's not clear to me that that's the optimal amount of time that we want to give teachers to demonstrate their craft. It may take more time than that. And providing tenure shouldn't be automatic. Not everyone should get tenure during that probationary period. And secondly, we need stronger processes for removing ineffective teachers. I think there are some jurisdictions where it takes too long to remove ineffective teachers, and it's too expensive. And this is something, by the way, that teachers agree with, right? If you poll teachers, they would like to see new mechanisms put in place for removing ineffective colleagues, even as they are strongly supportive of the basic concept of tenure. And I think the AFT has been a real leader on this by backing tenure combined with peer assistance and review programs. These, as many of you know, were first adopted in Toledo in the early 1980s. It provides for a process under which expert teachers from outside of a school will come in and seek to help struggling teachers improve their craft. But if at the end of the day a particular teacher is just not cut out for the profession, the teachers are involved in a committee that recommends termination. And this was highly controversial when first enacted, but over time has grown in acceptance. And you find higher rates of teacher termination of ineffective teachers in school districts like Montgomery County, Maryland, and Cincinnati and Toledo than you do when that use this peer review process than we see in places where the principal is in charge. peer assistance and review is a wonderful program that has not spread as widely as it could have or should have. So I think that's one major area of reform. I'll leave you with one concluding thought, and that is that in the lawsuits that we see in California and New York challenging tenure, the plaintiffs are raising a very legitimate issue, which is that low-income kids often do get the weakest, least experienced teachers. But I think they're barking up the wrong tree in going after tenure protections, which actually make it easier to recruit strong teachers in these schools. The advocates of reducing tenure protections have been invoking Brown versus Board of Education as a metaphor for equal opportunity that they say they're on this they say they're trying to champion. But I think the tech millionaires who are investing in lawsuits attacking tenure would be much better off if they actually dealt with the issue that Brown raised. The segregation of our schools, the racial segregation and growing economic segregation that we see in our public schools that help explain why poor kids are cut off from strong teachers. That would be a much more difficult fight to invest in, but it's had some positive impact in places like Connecticut, where the schools are around Hartford are much more integrated than they were because of a lawsuit. But ultimately, that would be so much more productive than going after teachers unions and tenure. Thank you.
Thank you. Rick, Randy?
Well, as Rick was talking, I'm like, okay, I'll get rid of that point. I'll get rid of that point. But let me see if I can talk a little bit on two of the points that Rick raised. From the teacher's perspective, defense of tenure, and also what it should be and the kinds of reforms that ought to happen. And I think I want to start with I often now call it K-12 tenure or due process or just cause dismissal, because K-12 tenure is a far cry from college tenure or from, frankly, the United States Supreme Court tenure. I did find it pretty interesting that someone who actually does have tenure for life, Justice Kennedy, kept on raising issues about K-12 tenure. They are really different. Tenure for the Supreme Court, it is tenure for life. It is lifetime. It is a job for life, and people know that regardless of what's going on. And frankly, the same in terms of colleges for those who attain it. K-12 tenure is really different. It is just cause dismissal. And at the end of the day, if that isn't what we hew to, then all of us, as I think Rick was suggesting, have to try to change it, because that is what's important. It shouldn't be a job for life, and it cannot be either a cloak for incompetence or an excuse for managers not to manage. And what has happened a lot is that because people presume it's a job for life, it becomes a very heavy-duty excuse for managers not to manage. And all the bad things that, frankly, a lot of us talk about, it can't be a cloak for incompetence. And so that became our North Star in a lot of the things that we've tried to do over several years. And we've tried to deal with both the issues of the tenure proceedings themselves and what to do to make them fairer and faster, but also, as Rick said, and I can get back to that in a minute, but as Rick said, really trying to think about, is there, and this is the harder issue, how do you effectively evaluate teachers and ascertain whether somebody is doing a good job for kids, and whether the job they are doing is and should be within the scope of both their responsibility and their performance. And that is the hardest question. And to have a discussion about tenure as opposed to having that discussion about that question kind of misstates the problem. And that's part of the reason why peer intervention and review programs were so good, because it grapples right with the most meaningful issue. And it's part of the reason why principals have sometimes used tenure as a reason not to manage, because thinking about this issue is, frankly, that is the new horizon, and it is a new horizon that we now have on our plate again in the aftermath of ESSA being passed. Because what ESSA just did was it said that the race to the top cut on how to do this didn't really work. The notion that you could actually figure out, get rid of all human interaction, and think about evaluation simply as an algorithmic exercise where you can figure out, both using two test scores, a math test score and an English test score of students, and using them as the basis for which to evaluate teachers, and then use all sorts of other sets of assumptions. That now, the federal government has now been told, and frankly, people on the right and the left said, you know, this didn't really work. When Mike Petrilli and the AFT agree that this really isn't working, there's something to be said for it. And so that has now been thrown out. The federal government no longer has the right to tell states what to do in this regard. And so I think, Rick, this will now give an opportunity to resurrect some of the peer assistance and review issues. So, what was the reason for tenure? Rick talked about some of it, but everybody, and I'm sure that there are people in the room who are thinking, oh, that was then and this is now. I'm going to do two this is now conversations. Daniel Drum, who is now a city councilman in New York City, and testing mania. Special needs kids. These are issues that affect us right now. Daniel Drum was a teacher in District 24 in New York City. The district school board at that point did not like the fact that he was gay, and they tried to railroad him out of the system in New York City. He had tenure. Now, the union protected him. We came out very strongly. But because he had tenure, and because there had to be a due process hearing, and the school board itself could not railroad him out, despite the fact that they tried to make his life a living you-know-what, and disclose that he was gay and things like that. That is a current day notion and realization. Now, it is true that those of us who are gay can actually get married on Sunday, but in many jurisdictions, we can still get fired on Monday. That's part of what due process is about. The second issue is this whole issue about what we just went through for the last decade. And if you talk to special needs teachers and special needs parents, or parents of special needs children, and what the testing regimen had done to their kids, and the agita, and the lack of the differentiation that they needed, thank God, teachers in the last couple of years have still had due process protections, because they became the front line for some parents about needs of kids. So when somebody says that it isn't needed right now, and the third issue is, I'll just use my own experience. Many of us try new things in classrooms. I was a high school teacher. 140, 150, 200 kids. everything you try, particularly the first time, is not going to work for every single kid or every single classroom. I can tell you with certainty that is true. So how do you then take the risk to try something new if something goes wrong and somebody's going to get mad at you? So those are kind of the current reasons. But, and I'll end with this, it doesn't mean that every law, the way it is right now, works. So one of the things we tried to do is we partnered with Ken Feinberg and the American Association of School Administrators to really think about how to deal with the issue about timetable. And how long should it take to actually do these cases? Because if it should only take 100 days or 200 days, why is it taking 5 or 10 years? And so we came up with processes and a timetable, which frankly several of the states in their new iteration of tenure in the last few years adopted, like New Jersey, like New York, and frankly the average number of days that it takes to do a tenure case in New York City is down to about 100. But the real issue, and that's the issue that I want to end with, is the issue that I started with, which is we have to have a credible way to not just throw teachers keys at the beginning of their career and say, go do it. How do we support them? How do we recruit them? How do we support them? How do we give them the tools they need? So then we can legitimately ask the question, have you taught it and have kids learned it? And so the new horizon now is going to be, how do we really get to have kids learned it, and if not, why, and what do we do? And is that, and that becomes the question that frankly we need to answer with schools that are performing really well, but particularly with hard to staff schools where we really need to get kids the teachers that they need and keep them so that we can turn those schools around. And so I think we have an opportunity now to actually start thinking about whether it's peer review processes, whether it's thinking about evaluation processes again, but the meat of this issue is how do we help create the tools and conditions teachers need to teach and students need to learn? How do we focus like a laser on the schools that are hard to staff so that we recruit and retain the best teachers available for the kids that need them most? How do we then have a rubric or a process where we really help answer the question, have we taught it? And then a process to really answer the question, have kids learned it? And when we do that, which is what the original peer assistance programs were about, then we will actually not have a conversation about tenure, but we'll have a conversation about continued growth and improvement in our profession, and that's where we need to go.
Thank you, Randi. Jane?